Frankenstein's author is Mary Shelley, wife of the Romantic poet Percy Bysshe Shelley, daughter of the writer William Godwin and of the feminist intellectual Mary Wollstonecraft. Mary was of reformist and liberal ideas. She had a rather irregular life, marred by several deaths. After having lost 2 children and several family members, she became a widow since her husband drowned in the Gulf of La Spezia. She went back to England to devote to writing as the only form of comfort and sustenance. In addition to reviewing editions of Shelley's poems, she wrote other novels, poems and tales. She died in 1851, probably for a brain cancer. Frankenstein, or the modern Prometheus, is written in first person and, in an interlocking game, has 3 internal narrators, Mr. Walton, Frankenstein and the monster himself. The narrative fiction is initially based on the letters that Mr. Walton sends to his sister during an adventurous journey to the North Pole, during which he first bumps into a gigantic being and then into a dying man. Once rescued after an initial reluctance, the stranger tells his story starting from his childhood, his youthful studies and his early interest for natural sciences that led him to Ingolstadt University. Driven by a sincere love for science, Frankenstein thought about having conceived the idea to create a human being. He thus begins to study the dead bodies and he gradually gathers in graveyards human remains that he assembles, giving life to a creature of gigantic proportions and hideous appearance. On a dreary night of November, Frankenstein succeeded in infusing a spark of being into the lifeless thing, who opened the dull yellow eye and started to move. His reaction of rejection and abandonment of the hideous creature provokes a vengeful fury. Frankenstein's family members and friends are killed by the monster. Following the unsatisfied request to create a female partner, the monster's revenge also falls upon Elizabeth on the wedding day. From that very moment, Frankenstein lives only to annihilate the monster, and the pursuit takes him to die in the polar ices. The monster too, satisfied in his revenge, and after having said that his cruelty is the product of his rejection by human beings, moves away declaring that he wants to let himself die. In the course of time, the novel had an outstanding success, until it became a real myth. There have been thousands of reprints and several movies, starting with Shirley Dolly's silent movie, 1910. Frankenstein Jr. 1974, directed by Mel Brooks, expressly refers to James Whale's Frankenstein of 1931, from the adoption of black and white and of a 1930s style and photography, to the direct quote. Frankenstein Jr. represents the parodistic reversal of Mary Shelley's novel through an unlikely happy end with a double marriage. Frankenstein with his assistant and the monster himself with Elizabeth. The main character is a New York University teacher, nephew of the famous scientist Victor Frankenstein, whose theories he rejects as absurd. In his desire to distance himself from his grandfather, Frankenstein even modifies his surname's pronunciation as Frankenstein. After having inherited the grandfather's castle in Transylvania and having recovered his nose, Frankenstein changes his mind and wishes to follow in the grandfather's footsteps, creating also himself a human being. In this undertaking, he is joined by his sensual assistant Inga, by the hunchbacked servant Igor, masterfully performed by Marty Feldman, and by the mysterious and grim Frau Blücher, hearing whose very name the horses whinny in fear. Unlike the novel, in the movie Frankenstein does not reject his creature, but after various vicissitudes, and thanks to the power of music, he manages to bring him back and to convince him about the kindness of his nature. Even the violence suffered by Elizabeth turns positive, because the girl appreciates the extraordinary manhood of the monster and falls in love with him. Thanks to a brain exchange with Frankenstein just when the angry crowd breaks into the castle's laboratory, the monster acquires part of his intelligence, and in the final scene, he shows up in the wedding bed while reading the Wall Street Journal. Beyond the exhilarating humor, the movie appears to capture the novel's sad message by overturning the end. Indeed, the book's key to reading is that the evil comes from unhappiness generated by rejection. The chain of criminal events is triggered by the contempt of man for the monster and by the resulting loneliness and lack of love. His ugliness is the only fault which the monster cannot redeem. Frankenstein is the scientist, therefore the parent of that unhappy creature who remained nameless. And the question that spontaneously arises is, why does Frankenstein hate his creature? Maybe in his act of foolish pride, he realizes that his own creation is just a grotesque imitation of the divine creation, and in front of the unclean, sacrilegious, hideous creation, the super clever scientist, the new Prometheus, gets scared and escapes. And the evil originates right from this escape. The theme of escape and pursuit is loaded with several meanings, and it is expressed in several ways. From the monster's persecution of the creator, that at the end will overturn, to the son's rebellion against the father, and even to the point of evoking the fears of the working class rebellion against the capitalism that generated the class itself. The writer in fact captures the profound tensions of her time, the injustices and the contradictions of the English society during the Industrial Revolution, the Luddite revolt that destroyed the machineries, imputing to them the working class misery, revolt suffocated by a violent repression. The novel belongs to the Gothic genre in vogue at that time, but it deeply revolutionizes it from within, paving the way for the science fiction genre and loading itself with ethical and social values. The monster's desperation that leads him to violence becomes a metaphor of social injustice. Workers express anger and malaise, destroying machines. But the guiltiest is the capitalist who exploits them. Above the contingent social message, the novel contains a universal message. Violence is born from marginalization and lack of love. If in terms of style the work is rather outdated, sometimes spoiled by emphasis and hyperbole, in terms of content it is extraordinarily updated. Indeed, my choice of this literary work was dictated, in addition to my personal interest in the horror genre, just by the topicality and depth of the several issues dealt with in the novel. The basic thesis that evil often stems from marginalization and loneliness is a universally valid truth. As the last word is left to the monster which, at the end of the novel, tells his anguished misery for having been unfairly rejected and deprived of any chance of human relationship, I am led to think that Mary Shelley is on the monster's side. In the tale, the monster says meaningful sentences, often reminding to Frankenstein that it was he who created him. So, I think that Mary Shelley considers Frankenstein responsible for the events and the monster aware of good and evil. Initially inclined towards good, he chooses evil in revenge for a denied good. I also think that, although not directly, the writer wants to criticize Frankenstein who, with an act that the ancient Greeks would have called the hybris, wanted to challenge the nature's limits and to create a human being, making himself equal to God. In her implicit criticism of Frankenstein's unreasonable conduct, I think she wants to warn mankind in general about the risk of creating something which might get out of control. She also deals with the theme, implicit and very topical, of warning the science that it should set itself ethical limits and have an attitude of great responsibility towards mankind.